Imagine silence, not just the absence of sounds, but that special, crystalline silence that existed before the beginning of time, when there was neither space for echoes nor time for counting moments. In this eternal silence, like the first note of the future symphony of the universe, a light was born. Not the light that is now pouring through your windows, but pure, immaterial light, which carries in itself the very essence of existence. And in this light, like reflections in a flawless mirror, the first creatures appeared, angels whose voices were to become the choir of creation, and whose hearts were to beat in unison with the heart of the Creator. Greetings, my dear listeners. Tonight, we will take a journey through the greatest tragedy of the cosmos, the story of how the most beautiful of angels became the enemy of all things. Please write in the comments what city you are from and what time it is. I wonder where in the world my words are being heard right now. Let us close our eyes and try to imagine a time when heaven knew no sorrow. A time when every angel was a note in an infinite melody of perfection. When their wings, like the northern lights, shimmered with all the colors of light, and their voices merged in a harmony that gave birth to stars. In this world where there was no before or after, where every moment was an eternity, and every eternity a moment, there lived an angel whose name meant light-bearing, Lucifer. Its beauty was such that if we tried to describe it in earthly words, our metaphors would seem like faint shadows. Imagine the dawn over a mountain lake when the first rays of the sun touch the water surface and turn it into a mirror of molten gold. Imagine the moment when the symphony orchestra strikes the first chord and the hall fills with a sound so pure that your heart sinks. Imagine the smell of apple blossoms in May, when the whole world seems renewed and full of hope. Now multiply all these sensations by infinity, and you get only a faint idea of what Lucifer was like before his fall. He stood at the right hand of the throne of the Most High, and the light from him illuminated the far corners of the heavenly chambers. His intellect was sharper than a diamond, capable of cutting through every mystery of the universe, and his voice, when he sang praises to the Creator, made the seraphim and cherubim weep with joy. Lucifer was not just an angel. He was a living embodiment of divine beauty, a conduit of light between the worlds, a bridge between the finite and the infinite. At that time, if time can be applied to the celestial spheres at all, heaven was a landscape of such beauty that the human imagination simply cannot encompass it. Soaring mountains, topped with crystal towers, from which golden light poured down, marking the presence of the Creator. Fields that breathed life, where every blade of grass was a living hymn, and every flower a prayer. Rivers of light flowing up and down at the same time, feeding gardens where trees of knowledge grew, their leaves rustling with the wisdom of the ages. Angels of various ranks inhabited these halls of bliss. The seraphim, with their 6 wings and faces ablaze with holy love, circled round the throne in a perpetual dance of worship. The cherubim, whose 4 faces reflected the totality of creation, stood as guardians at the gates of the mysteries. Archangels like Michael, clad in armor of pure light that shimmered with the glyphs of ancient languages, patrolled the borders between the worlds. Their wings, like solar flares and polar lights, left trails of stardust in the air. And among all this splendor, among this symphony of light and beauty, Lucifer occupied a special place. He was the first among equals, the closest to the throne, the most beloved of the children of the Most High. It was his duty to direct the praise of all the heavenly host, to be the conductor of this cosmic chorus. When he raised his hand, millions of voices would merge in unison. When he bowed his head, the whole universe stood still in awe. But in this idol of perfection, something happened that changed the destiny not only of heaven, but of all future creation. The Most High, in his unfathomable wisdom, announced the birth of a son, Christ, who was not just an angel, but the embodiment of the very essence of the Father. This moment, when the whole heavenly host gathered before the throne to hear the news of the new stage of creation, was a turning point in the history of the cosmos. Imagine that moment. Endless rows of angels, their faces turned towards the source of all light, their wings folded in reverent expectation. The air, if you can say that about the heavenly atmosphere, trembled with the anticipation of something great. And when the voice of the Creator, not a sound, but the very embodiment of truth, announced that Christ was now his equal, and his word must be obeyed as the word of the Father, the whole universe responded with a joyful chorus of Hallelujah. All but one. Lucifer stood among the cheering brothers, and something changed in his perfect face. It was barely perceptible, like the first crack in a crystal, like the first cloud in a cloudless sky. But those who could see that a shadow flickered in the depths of his luminous eyes, a shadow of what mortals would later call envy. Envy. What a strange feeling for a being who was the very embodiment of light. But perhaps that is the greatest tragedy of all, that even in a world of absolute perfection, the seed of discontent can germinate. Lucifer, accustomed to being first, accustomed to having the entire heavenly choir follow his hand, suddenly found himself in second place. Though his position had not changed, though he was still the most beautiful of the angels, a worm of doubt had settled in his heart. Why the Son? Why not him, Lucifer, who had served so long and so faithfully? Did not his beauty, his wisdom, his ability to lead legions of angels make him worthy of this honor? These thoughts seeped into his mind like drops of poison, poisoning what had once been a source of joy. He began to see the Father's decision as an injustice rather than a display of wisdom. He began to interpret the Creator's love for the Son as a disregard for himself. And the more he thought about it, the more his bright thoughts became darker, like the water in a mountain stream clouded by a fallen stone. Lucifer began to drift away from the general chorus. At first, it was imperceptible. He was still performing his duties, still directing the heavenly music. But something in his manner had changed. If before his movements had been like a stream of pure water, now there was a certain sharpness, a certain artificiality in them. If before his voice had been in perfect harmony with the whole choir, now the attentive listener could notice that he sang a little differently, as if he were singing his own melody. The other angels began to notice the change. Michael, the faithful guardian of the throne, whose heart beat in perfect unison with the Father's will, tried to talk to his older brother. Gabriel, the messenger of God, whose voice carried joy from world to world, tried to understand what was happening to the one he loved and respected so much. Raphael, the healer of souls, sensed that something sick had settled in Lucifer's heart and tried to find a way to heal it. But pride, and it was pride that was at the root of Lucifer's envy, is a special kind of disease. It not only affects the heart, but also blinds the mind, making a man or angel unable to see his own wrongdoing. The more the brothers tried to help Lucifer, the more he became convinced that they simply did not understand the depth of the injustice that had been done to him. Gradually, a group of angels began to form around Lucifer, whom he was able to convince of his righteousness. He was a master of words, a skillful orator, and he knew how to present his doubts in the light of the high principles of freedom and justice. "Don't we deserve better?" he said. "Should not our loyalty be rewarded? Should we blindly obey the new order without even having the right to express our opinions?" These words resonated in the hearts of some angels, especially those who, like Lucifer, held high positions in the heavenly hierarchy. They began to see the establishment of Christ's authority as a threat to their own status, a restriction of their freedom. They forgot, or were made to forget, that true freedom does not consist in being able to do whatever they want, but in harmonious union with the will of the Creator. So in heaven, which until then had known only peace and harmony, the first conflict was born. It was not an open rebellion, not yet. It was rather a fermentation of minds, an underlying discontent growing like a tumor in the body of the heavenly host. Lucifer had not yet declared open war against the Most High, but he was no longer the angel he had been before. And at this point in our history, it is worth pausing to reflect on how easily perfection can turn into its opposite, how quickly the light can fade when a shadow settles in the heart. After all, Lucifer was not created evil. He became so by choice, allowing envy and pride to overshadow the love that previously filled every cell of his being. Time flows differently in heaven than it does in our world. If we tried to measure it by our earthly standards, we would find that one heavenly day can contain 1,000 of our years, and 1,000 heavenly years can pass as a single instant. In this strange, fluid time, a storm was brewing that would shake the foundations of creation. Lucifer no longer hid his displeasure. What had begun as a quiet murmur in the depths of his heart had gradually turned into an open expression of dissent. He was leaving his Father's presence. His beautiful face was darkened by shadows of doubt, and his movements had that peculiar abruptness which is characteristic of those who feel aggrieved by fate. Imagine what it looked like from the outside. An angel of incredible beauty, whose radiance had previously warmed the hearts of all heavenly beings, was now emitting a cold, almost metallic light. His wings, which had once shimmered in all the colors of the rainbow, now flickered with sharp, cutting flashes. When he spoke, his voice, once as melodious as a mountain stream, took on new overtones of discontent and resentment. But Lucifer was too clever to express his protest directly. Instead, he clothed his doubts in the garb of high principles. He spoke of freedom, that angels should have the right to choose, the right to their own opinions. He spoke of justice, that loyalty and merit should be rewarded according to merit. He spoke of equality, that there was no reason to establish a new hierarchy in heaven. These speeches, delivered with that special eloquence with which Lucifer was endowed, resonated in the hearts of many angels. Particularly susceptible were those who themselves held high positions in the heavenly hierarchy. The angels whose names rang out in the heavenly halls, whose voices were heard from edge to edge of creation, suddenly felt that the new order could jeopardize their status. Among those who heeded Lucifer's words were angels of awesome power and beauty. Azazel, whose name meant the power of God, a master of heavenly fire, capable of creating weapons so powerful that they shook the foundations of the worlds. Semyaza, leader of the guardians, whose eyes saw secrets hidden from other angels, and whose heart burned with passion for the knowledge of the forbidden. Semyaza, whose wisdom was like a deep lake reflecting the stars, but whose lake was now clouded by poisonous doubts. Gradually, two camps were formed in heaven. On one side stood those who accepted the Father's decision with joy and reverence. Michael, with his unbreakable loyalty, Gabriel, with his pure heart, Raphael, with his healing love. On the other side were those who succumbed to Lucifer's convictions and believed that the heavenly order needed to be corrected. Michael, the archangel whose name meant "who is like God," could not bear to see what was happening to his older brother. He remembered that Lucifer, who sang hymns of such beauty that they made the seraphim weep. He remembered how they had patrolled the borders of creation together, how they had shared thoughts on the beauty and perfection of God's design. And now, seeing the one he loved so much slowly drifting away from the source of all light, Michael felt a pain that was hard to describe in earthly words. He tried to speak to Lucifer, tried to remind him of the joy they had once shared. "My brother," he said, his voice trembling with unshed tears. "Do you not see that your honor has not diminished? Do you not realize that Christ is not a rival, but the expression of the same love that created you and me and all the worlds?" But Lucifer had already traveled too far down the path of doubt to turn back. Pride, that most insidious of poisons, had already poisoned his ability to repent. He answered Michael coldly, almost contemptuously. "You don't understand, Michael. You are ready to blindly obey any order without questioning its justice. But I cannot accept an order that degrades my dignity and restricts my freedom." With each such conversation, the gulf between the brothers grew wider and wider. What began as a family dispute gradually turned into something more serious, a theological conflict about the very nature of authority, freedom, and obedience. Meanwhile, in the farthest reaches of heaven, where the wings of seraphim could hardly reach, strange things began to happen. The angels who had joined Lucifer began to experiment with powers that had previously been used only for creation. Azazel forged weapons, not metaphorical, but very real, swords of starfire, spears of hardened light, shields of crystallized space. Semyaza studied forbidden knowledge, trying to find ways to enhance his angelic nature by merging with the forces of chaos. These experiments did not go unnoticed. Where Lucifer's angels conducted their research, the heavenly fields began to blacken, the mountains cracked, and the air was filled with the smell of burning and metal. The beauty of heaven, its perfect harmony, began to be disturbed by the presence of something alien, something unnatural. The Most High, of course, knew what was happening, but his wisdom was such that he was in no hurry to put down the rebellion by force. Instead, he gave Lucifer and his supporters the opportunity to take their choices to their logical conclusion, so that all could see where the path of pride and disobedience leads. Finally, the day came, if it can be called that, in a world where time flows according to its own special laws, when Lucifer decided to openly defy the throne. He gathered all his supporters, by then almost a third of the entire heavenly host, and declared that he no longer recognized the authority of either the Father or the Son. Imagine this scene. In the center of the heavenly plain, surrounded by mountains of pure light, stands Lucifer in all his dark splendor. His beauty has not disappeared, but now it has become the beauty of a storm, the beauty of lightning, beautiful and deadly at the same time. Around him are legions of angels, their faces contorted with anger and determination, their wings outspread in a gesture of defiance. In their hands are weapons heaven has never known before. In their eyes is a fire that no longer warms but burns. Lucifer raised his hand, and his voice thundered over the expanse of heaven. I will tolerate no more tyranny. I will not bow my head to anyone who usurps the place that is rightfully mine. Freedom or death, that is our choice. These words sounded like thunder out of a clear sky. For the first time in the history of creation, words of open rebellion were spoken in heaven. Words that denied the very basis of the heavenly order. Voluntary and joyful submission to the will of the Creator. It didn't take long for the answer to come. Michael, clad in his battle armor of pure light, covered with glyphs in the language of creation, rose into the air. His wings spread out like two waterfalls of fire. His sword, forged from the very essence of justice, shone with blinding light. By his side stood Gabriel, Raphael, Uriel, and all those angels who had remained faithful to the throne. Lucifer, Michael said, and there was not anger in his voice, but infinite sadness. You were my brother, my friend, my teacher. But now you have become someone whose name I cannot utter without pain. In the name of the Almighty, I urge you to stop before it's too late." But it was too late. Lucifer answered the call for peace with a sword forged from materialized hatred. And then began what would later be called the war in heaven, the first and last conflict in the history of the perfect world. This war was unlike any battle our world had ever seen. Here it was not bodies, but souls that fought, not swords cutting flesh, but idas clashing with ideas. Each blow was not just a physical impact, but a philosophical argument. Each parry, a theological statement. Angels fought not for territory or resources, but for the very nature of reality. Michael and Lucifer met in the center of the celestial storm, their swords sparking with every clash. Lucifer fought with the fury of despair, realizing deep down that his cause was lost, but too proud to admit defeat. Michael fought with sadness in his heart, striking each blow as if against himself, because he was fighting against the one he had once loved as a brother. The heavens shook with this battle. Mountains splintered, fields burned, crystal towers crumbled under the blows of angelic weapons. The air was filled with the smell of cinders and metal, and the rivers of heaven were darkened with the blood of the fallen angels, the etheric substance that was to them what blood is to mortals. The battle lasted an eternity, and at the same time, a single moment. In the end, the inevitable happened. Michael's sword found its target, not in the sense that it killed Lucifer. Angels are immortal by nature, but in that it finally severed the bond that connected the fallen cherub to the source of heavenly light. At that moment, something terrible, and at the same time inevitable, happened. Lucifer, deprived of his connection to the divine light, began to change. His perfect beauty began to distort like a reflection in a broken mirror. His skin, which had once shone like polished silver, darkened and cracked like cooled lava. The eyes that had once danced with cheerful fire were now like two coals, burning with anger and hatred. The wings that had been like northern lights had become smoldering shadows, more like bat wings than eagle wings. But the worst change was not in appearance, but in essence. He who was the embodiment of light became the embodiment of darkness. He who had been a source of joy became a source of suffering. The one whose name meant light-bearing became Satan, the enemy of all that is light and good. And then, under the weight of their own guilt, under the weight of their final falling away from the source of all life, Lucifer, Satan, and all his supporters began to fall. They fell through the layers of the heavenly spheres, through dimensions and worlds, fell to the place where light ends and outer darkness begins, to the place which they had turned into hell by their own choice, falling through infinity. This is how one can describe the journey that Lucifer and his host made after their defeat in the heavenly war. They fell through layers of reality, through dimensions that have no names in human languages, fell past stars not yet born, past worlds not yet created, fell until they reached the very bottom of the universe, a place where light never penetrated, because this place was the negation of light itself. Imagine those moments of falling. If time had any meaning at all in this interdimensional journey, the angels, who had once soared into the heights of heaven on wings of pure light, were now flying downwards like shooting stars, leaving a trail of darkness and despair in their wake. Their bodies, that once radiated warmth and joy, now burned with the cold fire of hatred. Their voices, that had once joined in a heavenly chorus, were now screams of rage and pain. Lucifer was falling ahead of them all, and his fall was more terrible than the others, because he was falling from a greater height. He who had stood closest to the throne was now flying farthest from the source of light. Each second of the fall distanced him not only physically, but also spiritually, from the world he had once called home. And with each second, his essence became more and more distorted, like a photograph held too close to the fire. Finally, they reached the bottom. It was a place that could not be described in terms of earthly geography, because it existed outside the usual dimensions of space and time. If you try to find an analogy, it was like the deepest depression in the ocean, where there is never any light, where the water pressure is so great that it would crush any ordinary creature. But instead of water, there was darkness here. Not just an absence of light, but an active, aggressive darkness that devoured everything light and good. This place, which later came to be called Hell, was not originally meant to be inhabited. It was a kind of cosmic dumping ground, a place where the waste products of creation, everything that did not fit into the perfect harmony of the universe, were dumped. There were no beautiful landscapes like in heaven, no soaring mountains or crystal towers. There was only emptiness, filled with the ashes of unfulfilled hopes and the wreckage of shattered illusions. But Satan, for now he could only be called by that name, was not going to accept his fate. Even here, at the bottom of the universe, the fire of his former greatness still burned in him, though it was now fueled not by love, but by hatred. He rose from where he had fallen, shook off the cosmic dust, and looked around at his new realm. It is better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven, were the first words he spoke in his new home. And in those words lay the tragedy of his fall. He still did not realize that true greatness lies not in ruling over others, but in serving a higher purpose. Then Satan set to work. If he could not be a creator in the sense that the Most High was a creator, he could be a destroyer and a perverter. He began to mold his own kingdom out of chaos and darkness, a kingdom that would be the opposite of heaven in all things. Where heaven was bright, hell became dark. Where heaven's architecture was upward, hell's structures went deeper and deeper into the earth. Where heaven's music was harmony, hell's sounds became cacophony. Satan and his demons, for now the fallen angels had become demons, built towers of black obsidian that did not reflect light, but absorbed it. They dug caves so deep that they could hold entire mountains. They created rivers of molten sulfur, seas of boiling oil, forests of trees that never turned green, but only blackened by internal fire. Azazel, who in heaven had been the master of divine fire, was now the chief armorer of hell. He forged cannons that fired not cannonballs, but blasts of pure hatred. He created bombs that exploded not with a simple explosion, but with singularities, black holes that could swallow entire worlds. Semyaza, who had once been the keeper of heavenly secrets, was now the librarian of forbidden knowledge, collecting in his black books all the secrets of destruction and perversion. Samiyaz, whose wisdom had once been like a clear mountain lake, was now Satan's advisor, helping him plan revenge against the world that had banished them. His wisdom had not disappeared, but had become the wisdom of a serpent, dodgy, cunning, intent on causing maximum harm. Gradually, hell found its own twisted beauty. Yes, it was the beauty of destruction, the beauty of decay, but still beauty. Satan realized that he could not compete with the Creator in creation, but he could create an alternative, a world where the rules were completely opposite to those of heaven. Meanwhile, heaven was undergoing its own changes. After the rebels were driven out, the heavenly halls began to heal from the wounds of war. Fields scorched by angelic weapons turned green again. Mountains splintered by battle mended and became even more beautiful than before. The crystal towers were rebuilt, their light even brighter, as if purified by suffering. Michael, the victor in the heavenly war, was not celebrating his victory. He stood on the edge of the firmament and looked down to where his former brother was settling in the bottomless darkness. In his eyes, which had seen the glory of the throne, were tears, the same angelic tears that, according to legend, turn into pearls when they touch the earth. "Lucifer," he whispered into the silence of space, "my brother, why have you chosen this path?" Though between heaven and hell now lay an abyss that could not be crossed, Michael still remembered the bright angel that Satan had once been. The Most High, whose wisdom surpasses the understanding of even the archangels, observed these events with sadness, but without surprise. He knew that freedom of choice, even the freedom to choose evil, is a necessary part of love. You cannot force someone to love. Love must be voluntary. And therefore, there must also be the possibility of rejecting it. And then, in his infinite wisdom, the Creator conceived a new project, the creation of a world that would be the arena for the great struggle between good and evil. A world where intelligent beings could make a conscious choice between light and darkness. This world was to be the earth. Satan, for his part, was not inactive either. In the depths of hell, in the blackest of his caves, he was plotting revenge. He realized that he could not defeat the Most High in direct confrontation. His defeat in the heavenly war had made that clear. But he could try to strike at what was dear to the Creator, his creatures. And then, in his perverse desire to imitate the Creator, Satan tried to become a creator himself. But since he was deprived of the divine power of creation, his creation could only be a parody, only a perversion of true creation. Out of his own essence, out of concentrated hatred and malice, he produced the creature he called sin. Sin, his daughter, was the embodiment of all the evil that had accumulated in Satan's heart. She was beautiful, with that dark beauty that attracts and terrifies at the same time. Her eyes were like two black holes that swallowed up light and hope. Her voice sounded like a whisper of temptation that could seduce even the purest of souls. Her touch brought with it decay and death. But the worst thing about sin was that she was totally blind to the concept of love. She could not understand what it was, could not experience it, could not even imagine that someone could act out of motives other than selfishness and hatred. She was the embodiment of what the heart turns into when all love is gone. Looking at his creation, Satan felt something akin to pride. At last, he had created something with his own strength. True, it was a creation of destruction, not of creation. But it was still his own creation. He did not realize, or did not want to realize, that true creativity requires love, and that anything born of hate is doomed to self-destruction. Meanwhile, amazing events were taking place in the universe. The Most High had set about creating a new world, one that was to be home to a new race of intelligent beings. The 7 days of creation, though days here should be understood as epochs, periods of cosmic time, were filled with acts of creation of such beauty and majesty that even the angels stood in awe. Light was separated from darkness, heaven from earth, land from sea. There were plants that breathed life, animals that rejoiced in the simple fact of their existence, birds whose singing was a natural prayer. And finally, as the crown of creation, there was man, a creature made in the image and likeness of the Creator himself. Adam and Eve, the first humans, were not just perfect physically. They possessed that spiritual light that made them little brothers of the angels. Their eyes shone with the reflection of divine wisdom. Their voices sounded in harmony with the music of the spheres. Their hearts were tuned to the frequency of the Creator's love. Satan, watching this new creation from the depths of hell, felt a new wave of rage rising in him. These wretched creatures from the dust of the earth had received what he had been deprived of: direct proximity to the Creator, the right to walk and talk with him as children do with a loving father. It was unbearable. And then a plan was born in Satan's evil mind that was to be his revenge for all the humiliation. If he could not regain his place in heaven, he could deprive these new favorites of God of their privileged position. If he cannot create, he can seduce the created things of others into the path of destruction. The plan was simple in its diabolical sophistication. Satan knew that man, like the angel, has free will. Therefore, man could be seduced. He could be tempted to disobedience. He could be forced to repeat the same mistake he had once made, to put his own will above the will of the Creator. Silently, like a shadow, Satan left his infernal halls and headed for Earth. He walked along the paths between the worlds, the paths he had known since he was a messenger of light. But now, his footsteps left traces of darkness behind him, and his breath brought with it the cold of interstellar space. He was approaching the Garden of Eden, the place where the first humans lived in innocent joy, unaware of the danger that was creeping up on their paradise. Satan had a plan in his hands that he hoped would change the course of history forever and bring him the vengeance he craved. The Garden of Eden was a place of such beauty that even the angels stopped at its borders just to breathe the fragrant air of paradise. Here every flower was a living song, every tree a prayer to heaven, every stream the silvery laughter of the earth. The air here was as clear as mountain crystal, and particles of light floated in it, which made every movement, every gesture, like a dance. In the center of this garden grew 2 trees unlike any other in the world. The tree of life stretched out its branches like blessing hands, and its fruit glowed with a soft, warm light, promising eternal youth and joy to those who tasted it. Next to it, like its thoughtful brother, grew the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The only tree in the garden whose fruit was forbidden to man. Adam and Eve lived in this paradise as children in the home of a loving Father. They walked naked and were not ashamed, because shame is a shadow that appears only where there is an awareness of sin. Their bodies radiated the same soft light that came from the tree of life, and their eyes reflected the wisdom received directly from the Creator. They spoke to the animals in that primordial language which was understood by all living creatures, and the animals came to them as children to their parents for affection and comfort. Every evening, as the sun set over the horizon, dyeing the sky with the colors of precious stones, the Creator himself came to the garden to talk to his children. These conversations were not like the conversations we mortals have. It was a communication of soul to soul, heart to heart, when thoughts and feelings were communicated without words, when every glance was a revelation and every touch was a blessing. But even in this paradise, there was one commandment, one restriction. Of every tree in the garden you shall eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat of it. For in the day that you eat of it, you shall die by death. This commandment was not the arbitrariness of a tyrant, but the warning of a loving Father. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil held something that man was not yet ready to understand. The knowledge of the existence of evil that could destroy his innocent joy. Satan, creeping up to the borders of Eden like a shadow among the shadows, was well aware of the meaning of this commandment. He knew that man's free will was absolute. Man could choose obedience or disobedience, trust or doubt, love or self-love. And in this freedom, Satan saw his chance for revenge. He could not enter the garden in his true form. His presence would immediately desecrate this holy place. So he chose to disguise himself as a serpent, one of the most beautiful and wise creatures of the garden. In those days, snakes did not crawl on their bellies, but walked upright, their bodies shimmering in all the colors of the rainbow, and their eyes shining with intelligence, almost equal to that of a human being. Entering the body of the serpent, Satan felt a strange satisfaction. How symbolic! He, who had once been the tallest of angels, was now hiding in the body of a reptile. But his pride prevented him from realizing the depth of his fall. He saw it only as a temporary necessity, a stepping stone to the fulfillment of his plan of revenge. For days he observed the life of the first people, studying their habits, their characters, their relationships. He saw Adam laboring in the garden from morning till evening, naming the animals, tending the plants, cultivating the earth with the joy that is available only to one who works not out of necessity, but out of love. He saw Eve picking fruit, weaving wreaths of flowers, singing songs that were picked up by the birds and echoed in the mountains. And gradually, a plan matured in Satan's devious mind. He noticed that Eve often walked alone, especially during the hours when Adam was busy in the far corners of the garden. She was more impulsive, more curious, more open to new experiences. If anyone could be seduced, it was her. The day came when Eva was walking, as usual, among the trees in the center of the garden. The sun was at its zenith, and its rays, breaking through the leaves, created patterns of light and shadow on the ground that danced with every breeze. The air was full of the scent of flowering plants, birdsong, and that special smell that can only be smelled in places where there has never been sin. Eve stopped at the tree of knowledge, as she had done so many times before. She looked at its fruit, beautiful, full of juice, shimmering in all the colors of the sunset, and felt a slight curiosity. Why was this particular tree forbidden? What made its fruit different from all the others? But these thoughts were fleeting, like clouds in a clear sky, and carried no seeds of disobedience. Then a voice came out of the branches of the tree. Did God truly say, "You shall not eat of any tree in paradise"? Eve looked up and saw a beautiful serpent whose skin shimmered like jewels and whose eyes shone with wisdom. She was not surprised that the serpent spoke. All animals had speech in those days. But there was something odd about his question, something not quite right. "The fruit of the trees we may eat," she replied gently, "but of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of heaven, God said, 'Do not eat it or touch it, lest you die.'" The serpent grinned. If you could say that about a reptile. And there was something almost human in his smile, but cruel at the same time. "No, you will not die," he said. And his voice sounded like honey mixed with poison. "God knows that on the day on which you taste them, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like gods, knowing good and evil." These words fell into Eve's heart like stones into still water, creating circles of doubt that spread wider and wider. Was God hiding something from them? Did he not want them to become wiser? Was there knowledge that he kept for himself alone? Satan, who spoke through the mouth of the serpent, felt his words resonate with the woman's soul. He was a master of half-truths, the most effective of all lies. Technically, he was not lying. Their eyes would indeed be opened, and they would indeed know good and evil. But he was silent about the cost of that knowledge, the loss of innocence, the entrance of fear and shame into their lives, the severing of the thread of trust that bound them to the Creator. Eve looked at the fruit, and it seemed more and more attractive to her. She saw that the tree is good for food, and that it is pleasant to the eye and lustful because it gives knowledge. Two voices struggled in her mind, the voice of obedience, which whispered of trust in the Creator, and the voice of curiosity, which promised new horizons of knowledge. And then, in a moment that changed the history of the world forever, Eve reached out and plucked the fruit. She held it in her palms, feeling its warmth, its smooth skin, its heaviness. Her whole being trembled with the realization that she was on the threshold of the unknown. The first bite was sweet. The juice of the fruit was more delicious than anything she had ever tasted. It spread across her tongue in waves of unknown flavors. But with the second bite, something changed. The world around her seemed to fade, the colors less bright, the sounds less melodious. Something new and unfamiliar settled in her heart, a feeling she did not yet know how to name, but which we know as shame. When Adam returned from work, he immediately noticed a change in his wife. Her eyes no longer shone with that pure light he loved so much. Her smile had become uncertain, her movements stiff. And when she told him what had happened and handed him the rest of the fruit, Adam was faced with a choice that would determine the fate of all mankind. He could have given up the fruit and stayed true to God, but that would have meant separation from Eve, whom he loved more than life. Love, even the purest love, can cause a fall if it is placed above love for the Creator. And Adam, seeing the suffering in his wife's eyes, could not bear the thought of separation from her. He took the fruit and ate it, knowing it was wrong, but preferring to share Eve's fate than to be without her in paradise. The consequences were not long in coming. Their innocence left them like the passing of a day, leaving behind the cold of night. For the first time, they felt shame. For the first time, they realized their nakedness. For the first time, they felt fear in the face of the one whom they had previously met with joy. When in the evening they heard a familiar voice calling them. They hid among the trees, the first people to try to hide from their Creator. The conversation that followed was full of sadness, not anger, sadness. The Most High knew what had happened before it happened, but his heart, if I may say that about God, was broken by the betrayal of his children. Like a parent who sees that his child has chosen a dangerous path, he grieved not for himself, but for them. Punishment was inevitable, not as revenge, but as a natural consequence of their choice. The earth, which had previously given birth to everything by itself, now had to bear fruit only in sweat. Woman had to bear children in agony. Death, the very death of which the Creator had warned, entered the world as a shadow that would henceforth accompany every life. But even at this moment of supreme tragedy, the Most High did not leave his children without hope. Speaking to the serpent, and through him to Satan, he spoke the words that became the first prophecy of salvation. And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall smite thee in the head, and thou shalt sting him in the heel. These words meant that one day, from Eve's descendants, would be born one who would be able to undo what had been destroyed that day. One who would defeat Satan himself, though he would pay a high price for that victory. The seed of the woman, not the man, which indicated a miraculous birth, would strike the serpent in the head, dealing him a fatal blow, while he himself would receive only a wound in the heel. Satan, hearing these words, realized that his victory had been a Pyrrhic one. Yes, he had succeeded in seducing man. He had succeeded in bringing sin into a perfect world. But the cost of that victory was greater than he had bargained for. He had not just damaged the relationship between God and man. He had set in motion the mechanism of his own ultimate defeat. When Adam and Eve left the Garden of Eden, clothed in the garments of skin that the Creator himself had made for them, they carried with them not only the pain of exile, but also the seeds of hope. Yes, they had lost paradise, but they were promised that one day paradise would be restored, not through their own efforts, but through the deeds of the one who was to come. Satan returned to his infernal chambers, thinking he had won a great victory. But in his heart, if a demon can have a soul, he realized that the story was not over. The battle for the hearts of men had just begun, and the outcome was far from certain. Thus ended this ancient drama, the story of how the brightest of angels became the darkest of demons, how a perfect world was damaged by sin, and how at the very moment of the greatest tragedy, the foundation for the greatest triumph was laid. And when we reflect on this story today, in the silence of the night. When the stars look down upon us from the same height from which Lucifer once looked, we realize that it touches each of us. In every human heart, there is the same struggle between pride and humility, between selfishness and love, between the desire to elevate oneself and the desire to serve a higher purpose. The choice that Lucifer faced also faces us every day. Will we seek our own glory, or the glory of the one who created us? Will we trust in the wisdom of the Creator, or rely only on our own understanding? Will we walk in the way of love, or in the way of pride? The story of the fall of the angels is not just an ancient legend. It is a mirror in which we can see the reflection of our own souls, a warning of where pride leads, and at the same time, a promise that even the deepest fall is not final for those who are willing to accept an outstretched helping hand. May this story be a source of wisdom rather than a source of fear. May it remind you that true greatness lies not in being superior to others, but in serving others. May it give you the peace of a soul that knows that love is always stronger than pride, and that light always overcomes darkness, even if this victory does not come immediately and without struggle. Good night, my dear listeners. May your dreams be bright and the morning bring new opportunities to choose goodness. See you next time, when we will again go on a journey through the mysteries of time and space, through stories that help us better understand ourselves and the world around us.